Okay, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining me. I'm Mark Carney, and I am here with Nicolai Tangen, who is the CEO of the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund and many other things, one of the world's most successful private investors, with a very strong sense of purpose, which is why he is at the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, and a strong sense of purpose and practice at companies, and that's what we're going, and particularly at the boards of companies and the role of governance, and that's what we're going to spend most of the next 45 minutes talking about. So this is being live streamed, and colleagues here in the room, and I'll just alert those of us in the room that preserve a bit of time at the end for some questions from you as well, which will keep you from going to the forum party that I can hear outside. Nicolai's insights will keep you from doing that. Okay. Nicolai, welcome. Fantastic to have you here.
Thank you.
You published an article and some thinking entitled around It's Time for Boards to Sharpen Up.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to just throw it open. What do you think are some of the failings? Why are they dull? Why were they blunted? What do they need to do to sharpen up, in your opinion?
Yeah, we think they're failing in a way in three different ways. One is on the climate. We see that only 17% of companies actually have a credible climate plan, for a net zero plan, and we think that's way too low. Even though it's more than 17% of the emissions from our portfolio, it's just way low. And so they need to get their act together here. The second thing is on executive pay. So we think executive pay have really gone out of proportion. We saw, for instance, in 2021, executive pay up 15%. And we kind of think it's never been a worse time to kind of show that kind of corporate greed, because we have this living crisis. And we just think it's very, kind of just not the thing to do in this particular time period. And the last thing is on diversity. The boards have not done enough. We advocate and think there should be 30% women on boards. And so increasingly what we are doing is that we are voting against board members and we are voting against boards.
That's good. Okay, so you're putting your money, your votes, where your opinions are. So let's drill down on some of those issues and maybe a few more.
Yep.
And just roughly, at least to keep it straight in my head, I want to try to divide it between kind of structures and incentives, structures of boards, the incentives that are provided, and you mentioned executive pay is obviously one of them, and then the other aspect, strategy and purpose, the extent to which it's there. You didn't mention this just now, but you have made this point about the importance of splitting the role of CEO and chair. Why do you think that?
Well, I think it's extremely important to have somebody looking after the CEOs and making sure that they do the right things. What we have seen is that for the last 10 years, the proportion of situations where you have the board and the chair, the chair and the CEO as the same person has gone from roughly 45% to 35%. So it's moving in the right direction, but it's slow. And we think it's very important. We think it's important for executive pay, because otherwise you kind of negotiate with yourself as a CEO. We think that's generally not a very good outcome for us. It's important for how you look at transitions in the companies and so on, and we just think it's a more healthy kind of governance structure.
And if I were American, I sound American, but I'm not. But if I were American, I might say, what about a lead director? Can I have a lead director fulfill that role?
Well, we don't think it's the same. We don't think it's the same. And it's quite interesting because some of our views here is really having an impact. I'm at a big US company yesterday, and the top management told me that they were now thinking about splitting it on the back of our work in this field and how vocal we've been when it comes to that particular topic.
Yeah.
So the conversations we have with the companies are actually making changes.
Okay, so when the chair comes into most of these boardrooms, whether or not they are the CEO, there still is, in your opinion, and I think the numbers bear this out, an absence of diversity or lack of diversity, and you've come out as well in favor of 30% female or gender representation. Again, I'm going to challenge you, ask you to elaborate on the rationale for that. I think, and how you see momentum. Why is that not already the case? I guess almost it would be my sub question.
Yeah, so it differs very much from geography to geography. Yeah. You look at Japan, there are hardly any women on any boards. You go to Scandinavia, it's more like 40%, and so we think 30% is a fair place to start. And we think companies which have diversity at board level are basically just making better decisions. We see it in social psychology that decision making is better the more different opinions you have. So we think it makes sense from a business point of view.
Yeah, and let me just ask, because as well, obviously the sovereign wealth fund is very broad investment manager. You'd also have private market exposure, or you have some private managers, alternative asset managers, and the diversity within them. So they don't have board structures, but they have governance structures within. And how does diversity look in private equity these days?
I mean, diversity in the financial sector is awful.
Yeah.
It's just really, really not good. Yeah. And so you have some important initiatives, women in finance and so on, which are getting traction. And we are struggling with women in finance in all geographies. Yeah. And we are working on it ourselves. We have a goal of 40%. We are at just under 30, but it's a struggle.
Yeah, it's and from your perspective, just to keep on this theme, the effectiveness of targets in moving numbers.
Yeah, I mean, the numbers are moving, but very slowly.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I remember I was, if I may interject, when I was governor, Women in Finance and the 30% Club in the UK, as you know, came to the fore. And of course, one of the arguments was classic, well, you shouldn't have targets, it should be merit. But it was very effective in very quickly moving these numbers up.
Yeah.
In Canada as well, the same thing happened, but in the board space, but much slower in all other aspects of finance, including, we moved at the Bank of England, but not all the way to where it needed to be as well.
Well, we just had our first female governor in Norway in history. Yeah. She took over last year, so things are moving.
Yeah, and when you look at diversity, if I can broaden it out, both at boards, diversity more broadly, boards and senior management, what lenses do you use and what kind of conversations do you end up having?
Well, that's the area where we are kind of voting. But of course, you ideally want to have diversity in a lot of different things. You want to have diversity in education, expertise. Just the more diverse you are, the better it is. But these other things are much more difficult to measure and pinpoint and judge.
Yeah, I remember Christine Lagarde telling me when she became managing director of the IMF that they had at the time 90 different nationalities at the IMF, senior ranks of the IMF, and they all had PhDs from MIT.
Exactly.
So, like, on one level, it's really good. So let's talk about executive pay. You've been talking about executive pay. You've been thinking about executive pay. You mentioned it at the start. Let's break it down in terms of quantum. How much of the issue is quantum, just the absolute size, and then how much in terms of the structure and alignment with shareholders or broader stakeholder interests?
Yeah, very good question. We generally haven't got a big problem with size, and we think, who are we as Norwegians to decide what people in America should earn, right? That's not our job. But what we are really concerned about is the structure. We want the structure to be long-term. We want it to be linked to value creation. We don't want people to reset these type of structures, for instance, during COVID, to make it easier to achieve. And we want them to vest over a long period of time, and we want them ideally to be shared, stock-based rather than option-based. So that's what we do. And we increasingly vote against packages which we think don't fulfill these criteria. And what we see is we had some against votes last year, and afterwards the companies typically invite us to have a proper dialogue. And we do see that some of these packages are coming down this year on the back of that. So again, I think this dialogue works well. Now, the packages we are looking at, you have to kind of start to look at, one level to really scrutinize them. And so the average pay package now for S&P CEOs is roughly $15 million. And so at $20 million, we start to really investigate the structure of them. And that throws up roughly 150 companies and 150 packages that we are looking at.
And do you look at ratio to median income in the company, or the Gini coefficient, if you will, within the company?
No, we don't. So we look at CEO pay relative to their sectors.
Yeah. Okay.
But we don't look at CEO pay relative to the rest of the group or the rest of the corporation.
Yeah.
I mean, that's something you could do. But I do think it's particularly important at the kind of time we are now, when so many people are struggling. And so we think it's bad for business.
Yeah.
It is just bad for business to create this kind of tension within a company, because that's what you do.
Okay. There's a different set of issues. You mentioned longer-term vesting, and that popped into my head. It brought back memories of the financial sector in the UK, and the changes to the structure of senior manager pay in the UK, which involved the prospect of clawbacks and malices. So in future years, if something's discovered, poor management, obviously, more extreme things like fraud, or and in between excessive risk taking, that, as you know, sometimes takes a while to surface, the bonus can be pulled back. Views? I would think you would be.
Yeah, we do think there should be some clauses like that, and we do think also, of course, if you leave the job, your package needs to be reduced. So you need to have some kind of clauses like that as well.
Yeah. And I'll just make a short commercial for the senior managers regime in the UK, which is under renewed scrutiny. That one of the links in senior managers, so actually having clear responsibilities for senior managers, the chair, the CEO, the head of risk, et cetera, for example, in a bank, is to link some of the clawbacks to dereliction of duty, if you will. It's not defined that way as a senior manager, and that's something that has changed the risk appetite, I would say, to the better in the UK.
I agree.
Okay, so let's, I'm going to shift I'm going to have to remember the password for my iPad. No, here we are. Okay, shifting to...
Probably your wife's birthday.
Exactly. Exactly. Which is a good way to remember.
So you happen to remember that one?
Can I see your license? Here a sec. Okay. Dead serious issue, though, climate change.
Yeah.
You mentioned it at the outset. First issue I note that you mentioned, and as usual, knowing you well, backed up with hard data, right? 17% of companies having plans. So, what is the minimum you expect from companies with respect to addressing climate change?
Yeah.
And then what would you, moving towards best practice, what else would you like to see and over time expect to see?
Yeah, no, I mean, the minimum you can expect is to have a proper, credible plan for how to get to net zero.
Yeah.
And with target and sub-targets and so on, that's the absolute minimum thing you can expect. Now, we engage with companies in conversations, and I guess the only good thing you can say about it is that there are relatively few companies which account for a big proportion of the emissions. So when we look at our portfolio, 170 companies account for 70% of the emissions. So it's quite concentrated, right? So
roughly what proportion of your assets would that be if you took it on an equity basis?
I haven't got that exact number.
Finally, first time ever.
In mine,
first time ever. But it's 170 companies out of
9,000, right?
Yeah. Okay.
Now the good news is, so you can really focus in the dialogue on those companies, and we would have direct dialogue with roughly 1,000 out of the 9,000 companies, just under. In a way, we have active coverage and active engagements, and we have 3,000 company meetings a year where we engage, on these type of topics.
When you sit down with those companies, those 1,000 companies that you actively engage with, I'm just interested in process here. Is climate the first question? If it's in the 170 companies, where does it rank in terms of the question that?
It depends.
Yeah.
So it depends on how important it is for the companies and how big an issue it is for them. And also how much time and effort they are already spending on the issue, right?
Yeah.
So some companies are really good. You have a company like Holcim, which has got really, really good targets and structure on the type of plans they have. So there you probably need to spend a bit less time, and then you have other companies which haven't really come that far. You need to spend more time on that. We think it's a really material risk for a lot of these companies. And if you're not taken to the extreme in an uninhabitable world, the value of the sovereign wealth fund is zero. It is, it is to safeguard the value of the fund.
Yeah. Okay. I think I know the answer to this question, but just from your 17% figure. But even within that 17%, maybe I'll drill down within the 17% who have a form of plan, and it would be a subset with which would be in your portfolio, but although it's probably a pretty big subset now in your portfolio. Do you have the information, as you look at those plans, does it give you the information to make the judgment about whether or not they are transitioning to become aligned with these pathways towards it?
Well, I think in many cases it does, right? And in many cases it is science-based and so on. But in a way, I'd love to flip the question around, because you've spent a lot of time and effort on this. And what do you think?
What do I think I think it is. I'll put it this way. High level, I think these are the crucial few years in order to get that right to make those judgments. That's the first point. Because it's relatively new that companies have transition plans. In part, you're making a judgment just like you make about financial performance, about climate performance, whether they have the expertise, the CapEx plans. Ideally, you'd have some sort of track record to make a judgment whether, and you referenced a cement producer, right? Swiss cement producer, whether their ability to converge with that science-based pathway is there, in which case, actually, that contribution to the broader problem and the associated value creation is quite large. But my experience and my sense is, for example, GFANS, short commercial for GFANS, well, I'll now insert a short commercial for GFANS, which is we've agreed amongst the 550 members, $140 trillion of dollars of assets, that this is what we expect from companies for those plans. We just agreed that for COP27. So, well, there is some better and best practice out there. Now that's going to start to come through the market, complemented, reinforced by what you're doing at the Sovereign Wealth Fund. So I think this is the time where we're establishing that best practice. You did flip it around and ask me the question today, does the market have the information? No, the market doesn't have the information today, with some exceptions. It's there, but in most cases it's not. And that's what is in play to change. And the other thing, and I'm going to flip it back to you, actually to ask you a value question, because the way I think about it is, this is material value information, value creation, and the information is not yet in the market, nor is necessarily the expertise and the diligence being applied as you are applying it, and a few others are applying it to that information as it comes forward. And therefore, there's a huge value opportunity that's going to open up.
Yeah, no, I agree.
You agree? Okay.
Yeah.
Mark that down. It's much more valuable him agreeing with that than me saying that, I think, as we all know.
I think another thing we agree on is the backlash against ESG and how serious that is.
Yeah,
so
I wanted to. Yeah,
real worry, right?
I wanted to ask you about it in terms of, and you see it. You've got a global perspective. We see it most acutely or prominently in the United States.
Yeah.
How much do you see in Europe and other jurisdictions? How merited is it?
Yeah.
Maybe I'll ask you those questions.
Yeah, we're seeing it much more in America than in Europe.
Yeah.
And I think we're seeing it for a couple of different reasons. But one thing is that in a market where investors lose money, ESG drops down on the priority list.
Yeah.
because making money is top of the list, and so therefore some consider ESG more of a luxury problem. We don't think it is. We think it's dead serious, and we think you have to go at it all the time. The other thing is that the lobby, the oil and the gas lobby in America has become more vocal. I think they gained confidence because energy prices went up and they become, considered more important. So they just became more vocal and managed to kind of turn it around and make ESG into some kind of political question. And I just don't get it, because ESG has, in my mind, nothing to do with politics. It's just pure common sense.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, I think the way I've always viewed it, particularly around climate, is that there is a social and, by extension, political aspect to this, to the extent that countries set objectives based on what their citizens want. And citizens, vaguely want sustainability and agree, those aspects. That has become a much more specific objective through Paris and Glasgow to net zero, and as the means to address that. As that becomes clear, then the question becomes, well, if you're managing a company, a financial institution, do you have a plan to get there? We talked about that earlier. How likely is that to happen? At a minimum, boards and investors need to have the information and have an opinion on whether that's good or bad, for how well positioned the company is for that. And that's before you get, that's to protect your downside, and that's before you get to actually being part of the solution, providing what people want.
Well, I also think it goes hand in hand with running a good business, because let's say now you pollute and you have no plans, nobody's going to want to work for you, and nobody's going to want to buy your products. And your bank is not going to lend you money, and your insurance company is not going to insure you. So you're just not going to have a viable business. Yeah. Yeah. You just have to do it.
And actually, I'm just going to flip in, and I'll put the room on notice, and then as time ticks down, I'm going to open it up for questions from the floor here. Just within the fund and within the employees in the fund, maybe just give us an insight. I mean, you manage the fund, but you also run the organization. Yeah. And in terms of employee motivation, buy-in, sense of purpose within the fund, and how what we've been talking about, how that resonates.
No, it's really, really important, and I think we see it not only in the fund, but we see it across society. You need to have a purpose, a proper purpose in the company to attract the best people. Now we compete with talents across the financial sector, with big investment banks and people with deeper pockets than we have. We pay well, but we don't pay the best, and so we also need to offer people this particular purpose, and it's very, very important for the people who work for the fund.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think and I'm sure in your conversations, certainly with mine, with companies across a wide range of sectors, one of the learnings of CEOs is, guess what? The millennials, the Gen Zs who are coming in really care about these issues. And if you're not, and they can smell authenticity.
Huge,
yeah,
big time.
Very good. They're quite good at that. Actually, it's quite a problem with my kids. They can smell authenticity. Anyways, we should go to the floor for questions. Anyways, so why don't I? We've got about 5 minutes, and I'll just open it up and see if and just put up your hand, and lady in the front.
So I'm interested in the pool of people who are being brought onto boards, and I know you've taken issue with the kind of multi-board person, but the sufficient condition for getting a board seat on a public company is that you already have a board seat on a public company, and you came from the C-suite of a public company probably, which is a very limited pool of people. So how do you open that up, and what actually makes a good board member? Because there are challenges around people who don't understand the world entering in, I'm sure, but it's also a very limited pool.
Absolutely. So we also vote against overboarding, right? So overboarding is people who have taken on too many board positions, and we kind of give them points for being CEO in a company, and then being a chair, and then being a normal board members, and you get various points, and if it adds up to too much, we just vote against you. And we have those kind of situations everywhere, really. Now, being a board member is becoming very time-consuming, and there are some big liabilities, coming with it in terms of reputation and others. And so you just need to have the proper amount of time to put into this. And that's why it's important to have the right board members. And in my mind, I just think there are too many board members who don't take their responsibility kind of seriously enough, and who aren't vocal enough in the board meetings. And again, I think that's one of the problems by having the combined CEO and chair. They just set the agenda to too high a degree, and they can really sway the board in various directions. And that's why you want to have a strong independent chair.
So that was half the question, I think, which was the overboarding issue, if you will.
And where do you find
and where do you find the diversity at this point where we need to make a step change in diversity, and by definition, we're not,
Well, you need to look different places.
Yeah.
The same way as we need to look different places to get diversity into our company, right? You just need to recruit from different places in society than what you've done in the past. And guess what? Some of these people are going to make it. Tremendous board members. They're going to look at issues with a different kind of hat on, from a different angle, with different type of education, and so on. I think that makes for much better discussions.
Excellent.
Nicolai, for the 83% of companies which don't have a net zero plan that you accept, what advice, what are you asking from them? And if they don't provide a net zero plan, what do you do? What's the response?
Well, what we expect from them is basically to get their act together and hurry up, right? That's what we expect. And put it at the top of the agenda and work really hard towards, getting a proper plan.
Would you expect that plan, within the 12-month cycle to be in place?
Well, we actually seen a pretty big shift now from 6 months ago until now. Now, 6 months ago, there were only 10% which had a plan. Now that's 17%. And so we think there is more urgency coming in. And I think COVID did something really important for the thinking on climate. We saw how extremely small the world was, how quickly the virus could spread. You saw what the virus could do to the world, so then what can't the climate do to the world? And to me, it's akin to if you're an astronaut and we interview you before and after you go out in space. When you come back from space, you are more concerned about the climate and the environment, because you just see how small the world is, and COVID worked in exactly the same way. So there is more urgency, and people seem to be more serious about it.
Yeah, excellent.
The other big institution in your field is BlackRock, and they're American. Is there a special Norwegian or European approach to your work? I mean, for example, the split of chair and CEO, that's not very well regarded in the US. BlackRock doesn't really insist on it, while for you it's very important. How would you define in 2 or 3 steps the big differences between you and BlackRock?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, without being specific about BlackRock, because I released a podcast with Larry Fink last week, a bit of an advertisement for that. Yeah. But if you look at issues, for instance, such as executive pay, why are big American shareholders not more vocal on executive pay?
Yeah.
Well, because they make too much money themselves. If you run a listed US fund manager and you make a fortune, can you be critical when it comes to other CEOs? Of course you can't. You have no credibility, and you're just shooting yourself in the foot. And that's why it's important for us to raise this issue.
Fantastic. Okay, we've got time for one more question. Who's got the one more question and no microphone?
We can repeat.
I can repeat your question.
I can also be pretty loud.
Yeah, and I'll lean forward. Yeah, okay.
When I researched this topic, one of the most interesting findings is that boards that tend to rate a little bit poorly on a lot of things tend to underperform as much as boards that tend to that rate very badly on just one thing. And I think it probably has to do with culture. When you're doing a little bit poorly on a lot of things, where's the culture of good governance? I wonder if this plays into your thinking, kind of the spread versus the depth of quality or poor quality as you're evaluating boards.
Yeah, I think we need to look at both, right? I do think, the 3 topics that we mentioned, we think they're all important. The climate and pay and diversity. But you often see that a company which is not doing great work at the board level, they are also doing badly operationally, right? I just think these things are linked. I mean, what do you think, Mark?
I think that's right. I think I absolutely agree. As well, two things I reinforce. One is a series of small failures. Also, I know as a regulator, like that's a real tell. Just in terms of the culture, we can't all be excellent at everything, but if you're below average at most things, that's a tell on culture, and then that eventually leads to a challenge. Second thing, which you alluded to quickly earlier, Nicolai, is around, boy, if you're not taking one of the biggest risks seriously, climate risk/opportunity seriously, what else are you not doing, and where else? And so the alignment, the value alignment that comes there. Okay, I had one risk, which was to run over, and I think I've just blown to that. So I'm going to bring this as fantastic discussion to a close, and I want to bring it to a close by saying, I mean, you could have done lots of things with your time, with this decade of time. You chose to do this role out of a sense of public service, and to secure the retirements and the futures, not the retirements, but and beyond of the citizens of Norway, but also with a sense of purpose and improving society. And because you run the fund you do with your colleagues, it has an influence on the purpose, the climate, and the inclusiveness of societies around the world. So thank you for what you and your colleagues are doing, for taking the time, and for everyone in this room.
And thank you as well. Thank you.